Babylon. And if this is the first time you've been here, thrilled you're kind of jumping in midstream here. You can pick up all the teachings from the past couple of weeks on our website if you're interested in that. But we have been looking at this story, this ancient story from the Hebrew Scriptures, from the Old Testament, and looking at Daniel and his friends, his three friends, who were taken as exiles into this foreign land, a place called Babylon. They were held there against their will, but in that place, God was with them. God raised them up to a place of power and just uniqueness, and God used them to change the hearts of people in their culture. And so we've been looking at Daniel and this story and how God has used him, and we've been asking questions to say, how might God want to use us in our culture? That just as Daniel was placed in a culture that did not reflect the values of God, we would acknowledge that in our culture today, we live in a place that does not reflect the culture and the values of the kingdom of God. There's dissonance we feel living in the world today. And so we look at Daniel, and we look at his example, and we say, okay, like, what does this mean for us? And what does it mean for us? And sometimes, because it's the water we swim in, it can be hard to say, but like, okay, what are those places in our culture here today? I mean, we're not living in ancient Babylon. We don't have kings that are going to just like put people to death. Today we're talking about the story of Daniel and the lion's den. This is the most popular story. If you have a kid's Bible, you've read this Bible to your children. This is the one story of Daniel that like always makes the kid's Bible, right? It's the Daniel and the lion's den. And you never ask the question, why did they have a lion's den? Like, this wasn't Daniel in the zoo, like the lion exhibit at the zoo. It was a lion's den. It was a prison, but it wasn't a prison where, like, hey, you're a criminal, you go into prison, serve your time, pay your debt to society, and come out. This was, you go to prison and you get eaten by lions. We would look at that and say, oh, that's horrible. Like, right? That's horrible. And so we can kind of look at this ancient civilization and see the problems with it, but it can be really hard for us to see the problems with our culture. And so if we believe that God wants to use us in our day, in this culture we live in, to help to bring healing, to help to bring life, to help people flourish and thrive as God has always intended, we have to understand, we have to diagnose a bit our own cultural situation. And so I want to just take a few minutes as we start to just say, okay, what is it about this world around us that we would diagnose and say, here are some problems, here are some issues. And Josh Smith, who's a pastor from Portland, has these three components. And I want to just kind of walk through these because I think they're helpful. The first one is this, that self is king. In our culture, self is king. You might say selfie is king. And this is nothing new. Human beings have always wanted to rule the world. We have always wanted to run our own lives. This is as old as Genesis 3. It's as old as sin, right? That we want to be king. We want to define what is good and what is evil on our own terms, and we don't want anybody else to tell us what's good for us. Does that make sense? Do you hear tenors of that in our culture? No. Who are you to tell me what's right for me? I'm going to decide what's right for me, and you decide what's right for you. I'll live and let live kind of thing. So this is the age in which we live, where self is king. We talk a lot about self-actualization, self-discovery, self-expression. And while this is nothing new, one of the things that is new is we have all of these tools that will now help us create a universe where we are at the center. I left my phone back at my seat. But if you have your phone, right, your phone is an incredible tool that puts you at the center of your universe. You create a whole digital world that orbits around you and your preferences. You remember the days when like your family would sit down to watch a TV show and you all had to sit in the same room and watch the same screen and you were at the mercy of whatever the broadcasters put on that channel for that night? And if you didn't like it, that was your only option. You didn't have other options. And then the commercials came on, and you couldn't, just pay for an upgrade and go through the commercials. You had to, in that commercial break, you had to run to the bathroom and to the fridge and get everything and try to make it back before the content started, or you would miss maybe part of your favorite show. Do you feel the pain? Does any of you remember this? If you're under 25, you've never lived in a world like this. because everything is dictated around your preferences. You get to decide what entertainment you take in. And so entertainment's a big piece of this, where self is king. You don't have to listen to any music you don't want to, right? You can listen to only your favorite songs all the time with no interruptions. And so this is a part of our world. But we would acknowledge, to be a Christian, to be a follower of Jesus, is to surrender ourselves to Jesus as Lord. So the value of the kingdom of God is a direct affront to self being king, to self being God. The message of Christianity, the message of the gospel, is to say, actually, to experience the kind of freedom we just sang about, we actually surrender ourselves to Jesus and listen to him and obey him, because we think he knows what he's talking about. We think he is the embodiment of truth, the way, the truth, and the life. So this is number one, self is king. Number two, because self is king, we have an ethical breakdown. Because I get to say what is ethically, morally right for me, and you get to say what is ethically, morally right for you, there is all kinds of confusion about what is actually right and what is actually wrong. And sometimes we can even to have a pastor say, you know what's, that's wrong. It feels like, if you're steeped in this culture, it feels icky. Or to say, that's sin. It's like, well, is it really? Who are you to say what's sin and what's not? Maybe you feel some of that inside yourself. It feels judgmental. Well, who am I to judge? And so we have this ethical breakdown that we've lost a sense that there is truth. There is this sense of God's morality, God's ethics that come to us from somewhere else, from somewhere outside of ourselves, and we submit to them. And C.S. Lewis wrote this amazing little book. It's actually a series of lectures. I think it was in 1950s or something, called The Abolition of Man. And you can actually find it on YouTube if you just want to if you don't want to read the book. I'll talk about that in a minute, not reading books, but if you want to listen to it on YouTube, you can do that. But C.S. Lewis, in the 1950s, he sees all this playing out, and here's what he says. He says, when we lose the truth, that there is transcendent, objectively right and wrong truth that comes to us from God, when we lose that, the only thing we have left to decide what will I do, what won't I do, is whether I want something or not. Do I want it? And if I want it, well, then it must be good. If I don't want it, then it must be bad. That's terrifying. Because I know myself, and I know the things that I want, and I know the things that I want are going to lead to destruction, are going to lead to bump up against other people and what they want, and there's going to be conflict. And so this is a huge problem if the only thing we have to make our way in the world is what we want, because we are ourselves, we are not just pure goodness. Ourselves are this mixture of how God created us to be and our own fallen, sinful nature. We just acknowledge that. That's what the Bible teaches. And so we have this ethical moral breakdown. There's all kinds of confusion. The only sin our culture recognizes, secular culture recognizes, is the sin of telling someone else that what they're doing is sin. I mean, and if you want to experience the ire, right, of the world, you just sort of say something is objectively wrong. And you will get it. You will get this sort of backlash to say, who are you to say something is wrong? So this is number two. And number three is, so self is king, ethical breakdown, and the third one is immediacy. Because I'm in charge, I want what I want now. I want it right now. I want the information that I'm looking for now. I did this technology fast. We did this in the tech series a couple of months ago, and I realized I went 48 hours without any technology, without a radio, without my phone, no computer, no email. It was glorious, and it was so painful. Because I realized, I'm working on this project at home. I had all sorts of time I didn't know I had when I didn't have my devices. And I'm working on this project, and I needed an answer. And I realized, I don't have the answer, so I'll just look it up on YouTube, and I'll try to find it. And I realized that's not an option for me. So I tell Carmen, hey, look it up on YouTube for me. bypass the system. But I realized like I'm so geared that I want my answer now. But without having that in play, it's like I actually have to think about this. And the thing ended up getting fixed, but it took me a little bit longer. Like we're so geared, I want it right now. We find ourselves getting like angsty at the microwave that it takes so long. It's like 2 minutes for microwave popcorn, are you kidding me? Like, some of you remember the days when you had dial-up internet. Do you remember the sound of dial-up internet? Google it. Like, listen to the sound of dial-up internet. It is the most painful, agonizing sound you can imagine. But it was the world coming to us. It was this amazing invention. But now this is the bane of our existence. You get that and you think, I got to call somebody. We need an upgrade. Like, this is a problem because we don't like to wait. We want it now. Faster is better. And here's the problem with that. Discipleship, being formed in the way of Jesus, is what Eugene Peterson says, a long obedience in the same direction. That is not fast. That is this slow steeping in the teachings of Jesus and in the community of faith. And it is a lifelong process of just simple disciplines, again and again and again. Life with God. And so we realize that there is this tension between the kingdom of God, these values of the kingdom of God, and the culture we live in. And for us to remain faithful to God, we have to acknowledge it. So let's take a look in Daniel 6 and how some of these things are addressed and in how God might want to speak to us and encourage us today. So Daniel 6. Remember from last chapter that Belshazzar, the Babylonian Empire, has just fallen. And Darius, the new king, the Mede-Persian king, has taken the throne. So chapter 6, verse 1. You follow along in your Bibles. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, and one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. So it's a king's way of delegating. He gives these 120 people authority, and then he sets 3 people over them and say, hey, you're accountable to these 3, and Daniel is one of the 3. So he's like a high position in the kingdom. Verse 3, now Daniel so distinguished himself among these 3 administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They couldn't find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Now, this is where our cultures separate. Can you imagine a political leader with no corruption and no negligence, right? No skeletons in the closet. This guy is squeaky clean. And not only is he squeaky clean, he's like really good at his job. And he's hated for it, right? They don't like him much for this. So they're looking, they're trying to find ways to accuse him. So verse 5, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So they look at him and they say there's no corruption, there's no negligence. He's just like, man, he's a shining star. But here's his weakness. His complete allegiance is to his God. This God, Yahweh. The God that was revealed to Israel, but it was God of the whole world. His allegiance is there. And so if we can make a law of the land of Babylon that would in some way conflict with his allegiance to his God, he's going to choose this and we can trap him. So they're trying to sort of find a way. They have no question that his ultimate allegiance is to God and not to Babylon. So verse 6. So these administrators and satraps, they went as a group to the king and said, may King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human during the next 30 days, except for you, your majesty, they shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue this decree, put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Double stamsies, no erases. Do you still do that? Is that still a thing? Maybe not. Scrap that one for the next time I preach this. So this is what they do. Darius is the king, right? He's the one who has all the power. And here's what I would submit to you, is that Darius represents our secular culture. Darius represents human nature that wants to be king. It represents that place inside of us that wants to rule and that really likes when our ego is inflated. And so these other leaders, they come and they say, Darius, live forever, long live the king. You're the man. Let's just put you at the center of the world. Let's just, everybody's going to pray to you. We'll make you like a god. And anybody who doesn't acknowledge you on the throne, they'll be punished. They'll be thrown into the lion's den. His vanity is his vulnerability. My vanity is my vulnerability. Your vanity is your vulnerability. That ego that wants to run things. That's the access point that the enemy has to us to say, no, like your preferences, you should get to decide. So they come and they kind of cause him to, they lead him to make this law that sets Daniel apart. It's gonna force Daniel to choose. Is he going to pray to his God, to Yahweh, or is he not? So he puts the decree, puts it in writing, verse 10. And now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, what did he do? He went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God just as he had done before. Now these men went as a group and they found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and they spoke with him about the royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human except you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den? Like Darius, did you remember that you just issued this presidential decree several days ago? The king answered, yes, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Double stamsies, no erases. Then they said to the king, so Daniel, this exile who was brought from Judah, this outsider, this foreigner, he pays no attention to you. He pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. And when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. Why? Because he knew that Daniel was the only one in this whole kingdom who was qualified to lead. And he was determined to rescue Daniel, and he made every effort until sundown to save him. But the men came to him and said, King Darius, remember, your majesty, the kingdom, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. Double stamsies. So the king gave the order for Daniel to be thrown into the lion's den. So do you have this picture? Here's this guy, here's Darius, who represents all of us, who represents secular culture, who wants to be king, and he's kind of a dimwit. That's kind of the point of this story of Daniel, that these kings like Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar and now Darius and later Cyrus, their ego just sort of gets inflated, and then he makes this decision that he can't foresee the outcome. He can't say, by me doing this, it's going to cost me, and it's going to cost somebody I care about dearly. This is what happens when we try to run the world. We make decisions and we think, this is a great decision, and it ends up leading to pain and damage and destruction in our own lives and the lives of people we love. And then he's powerless to change it. Right? He can't even do anything to change it. He recognizes he does not have the power. And so he gives the order for Daniel to be thrown in the lion's den. But this is what he says in verse 16. He says, Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, may he rescue you. I don't have any power to rescue you. This is what Darius admits. May your God rescue you. It's out of my hands. I don't have power. I am not qualified to be king of the world. This is a story about our own ineptness to make decisions about these things like ethics and morality, because we don't have the wisdom. We are Darius in this situation. But Daniel, the moment the decree is issued, what does he do? He starts praying. Does he start praying? No. He keeps praying. He's been praying his whole life. He's been in Babylon now like 70 years. He's an older man, right? I mean, he's been praying, it says 3 times a day, as he has always done, and nothing changes. He just keeps praying. He goes up to his window and he opens the window, and here's the interesting thing. You notice which direction the window is pointed? Which direction is it facing? Toward Jerusalem. Which direction is Jerusalem? Anybody real quick? Right now? Can you point to it? Right. So here's the interesting thing. Jews in the Old Testament had laws that said, okay, if you're praying somewhere outside, if you're like in Babylon or what they call diaspora, if you've been like a seed that's been blown by the wind and you're taken somewhere else, when you pray 3 times a day, which was Jewish custom, you can read Psalm 55. It says, David says, I cry out to you, God, morning, noon, and night. So Jews prayed 3 times a day, and they always says, if you're somewhere outside of Israel, you pray toward Israel. If you're in Israel, you pray toward Jerusalem. If you're in Jerusalem, you pray toward the temple. And if you're in the temple, you pray toward the Holy of Holies. There are these like concentric circles of holiness, right? And so you just orient yourself. If you end up reading the prayer of Solomon in 1 Kings 8, as he dedicates the temple to God, he builds the temple, dedicates it to God, and you read his prayer, he says these amazing things. He says, like, God, may you hear when anyone prays toward this temple. May you hear from heaven and answer their prayers. So this is what Daniel does. He's living in Babylon, but he keeps praying toward Jerusalem every single day. He had been formed in prayer. This long obedience in the same direction, so that when the crisis happened, when he found himself in a place where he was up against this death sentence, where he had been sort of put in the middle, he didn't start praying, he kept praying. And when he was eventually thrown into the lion's den, it wasn't like, God, help me now, like, right? He wasn't like just whispering that like, oh, help, oh, help, oh, help, like when the blue lights are flashing behind you and you start praying, right? He's been praying the whole time. And here's the thing, like, if we have been formed in prayer, do you know what prayer is? Surrender. Prayer before it's anything else is surrender to God. It's saying, God, Daniel, he gets down on his knees, he opens the window, and he says, God, I don't have what I need. I need you. I surrender to you. You are the king of the world. I'm not. And he just prays and asks for help. This is what prayer is. Do you have like a rhythm of prayer? Because life is hard, and life will be hard. And there are difficult things that come at us. And if we don't have these rhythms of prayer, if our souls have not been steeped in the presence of God through prayer, it's going to be really hard for us to have the grace that we need to just walk faithfully through the hard things of life. This is what Daniel teaches us, to these rhythms of prayer. These rhythms of prayer. So Daniel goes into the lion's den, and the next Darius goes home, and he's so distressed at what's happened. He goes home and he turns off Netflix for the night. There's no entertainment. There's no food. He just shuts all of that down, which is another picture of what's really essential in our lives. Like, we think entertainment is like the thing that brings us joy, and then Darius, when his friend is in this trouble, he doesn't have any entertainment. And then in the first light, he runs back to the tomb, and he calls out, and he says, Daniel, did your God who you serve continually save you? Was he able to rescue you? And Daniel calls out of the silence, yes, my God was able to rescue me. So Darius ends up issuing this decree, because kings really like to issue decrees. And he issues this decree, and you can check it out at the end of chapter 6, right? This is what he says. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever, and his kingdom will not be destroyed, and his dominion will never end. He rescues and saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth, and he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and of King Cyrus the Persian. At the end of this story, because of Daniel's faithfulness, Darius recognizes that he is not king. He recognizes it is not his kingdom that he is to build. He recognizes that God is the one who he is made to worship. And this is the message for the church. This is the message we're called to embody in a culture that says self is king, is to say we have no reason, we have no business being on the throne of our lives or of the world because we don't have what it takes. The seat is too big. The crown is too heavy. We were never meant to wear it. And so ultimate freedom comes in surrender. In surrender. To say, Jesus, you're Lord. You're Lord of my life. You're King of the world. God, may your kingdom come. May your will be done in my life and on earth as it is in heaven. Help me to serve you. Help me to follow you. See, the beautiful thing about prayer is that we don't have to pray toward Jerusalem. We don't have to pray toward a temple. We don't have to pray toward the Holy of Holies, because you know where the Holy of Holies is? It's within you. It's within you. Jesus, he was raised from the dead as he came out of his den of death, as the stone was rolled away and he was raised from the dead. He unleashed the Spirit of God into his people so that we have access to the Father, to the Holy of Holies. We have access to the Creator of the world any moment we choose. And one of the most painful things for me to admit is I choose far too rarely. I choose far too rarely. God, we want more than anything else to be your people. God, what we choose is to surrender to you. We choose, God, to acknowledge that you are Lord, that you are King, and we are not. God, you have given us the most amazing gift, the gift of your presence, the gift of access to you. And we confess, God, that we just continue to run our lives. So God, we ask that you would teach us the discipline of prayer, that you would teach us the long, slow obedience of prayer, of surrender to you. God, that you would so fill us with your Spirit, so form our souls in the way of Jesus, God, that when difficult things come in our lives, God, that we would have resolve, that we would have grace, that there would be nothing that would change, that we wouldn't panic and start doing these spiritual practices, God, but they would be so part of our lives, God, that we would just continue to experience your ongoing grace and presence. God, as we sing this song, would you move in us? Would you take any roadblocks from our experience with you? Would you remove them? Any places inside of us where we are king, where we have been setting ourselves up in this place of power, God, help us and convict us, encourage us to step off of that place and to surrender to you, God, to bring freedom into our lives in these places. We love you, Lord.